Today's story is one of betrayal so brutal it nearly erased a man from the world, told beneath the burning skies of the Wild West. A place where bullets speak louder than truth, and mercy is rarer than water in the desert. It's where two broken souls cross paths at the edge between life and death. It started with a moment of weakness, one collapse in the dust that would change everything forever. Before we kick off this adventure, don't forget to hit like on the video and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. That day, the wind didn't wander through the canyon. It howled. Its shrill cry tore through the stillness like a blade, dragging the bitter scent of dry sage and ancient dust across the basin. Above, the sun burned without sympathy in a sky bleached pale by relentless heat, staring down at human suffering with indifferent eyes. Below, a lone figure moved, though calling it movement was generous. Thorn Kess was barely staying upright. At 32, he had once been forged of iron and will, a cavalryman who had ridden countless hard miles. But now that iron was warping under pain. His face carried the marks of every storm he had endured. A rough beard shadowed his jaw, carved by years of wind and war, and his eyes, once sharp and watchful, were now dulled by agony. A dark stain spread across the shoulder of his dust-caked coat, heavy and wet. The wound wasn't just from a bandit's bullet. It was the brand of betrayal. Men he had shared fires with, men he had bled beside. They had turned their rifles on him. And for what reason? Because Thorn had refused an order meant to destroy innocent lives. He chose honor over command. The cost of that choice was a bullet through his shoulder, and a death sentence written in blood. Exhaustion wrapped around him like chains, the kind that settles deep into the bones, making every breath feel sharp as broken glass. He had been running for days, dust trailing behind him like restless ghosts. But now, there was nowhere left to flee. His horse, a loyal roan that had carried him through the worst stretches of Badland, had collapsed miles back. Thorn had left the animal beneath a mesquite tree, whispering a final apology before staggering onward alone. Now, the loneliness was complete. He stood trapped within a maze of stone. Canyon walls rose around him like silent sentinels, holding the heat captive. No water waited here. No mercy either. Thorn stumbled forward, boots dragging through loose gravel and sand. He clutched his wounded shoulder, fingers slick with blood that refused to dry beneath the sun. He was no longer searching for escape. He wasn't thinking of towns, doctors, or miracles. Those belonged to a life already buried. All he wanted now was a place to lie down, a shadow deep enough to hide his body from circling vultures. He meant to die on his own terms. Far from the men who had betrayed him, let the mountains be his only witnesses. Dizziness rolled through him in violent waves. The red cliffs pulsed and tilted. Copper and dust coated his tongue. Death felt close, just a few steps behind him, patient and certain. Then he saw it, a narrow fracture in the canyon wall, a thin slit carved into stone like an old scar across the earth's face. He hoped for nothing more than shade. But as he neared, something impossible caught his eye. Thick green ivy spilled across the opening, alive and vibrant against the dead red rock. It didn't belong. It looked like an error, or a blessing. Driven by desperation, Thorn forced his way forward. With the last strength in his body, he reached out and shoved through the hanging vines. The change was immediate. The burning heat vanished. The screaming wind softened into breath. It felt as though he had crossed into another world entirely. The air was cool, unnaturally so. It carried the scent of damp soil, crushed mint, and clean water. Above, branches formed a natural canopy, filtering sunlight into soft patterns that danced across the ground. An oasis. A hidden garden the world had forgotten. Thorn took one step, then another, his boots sinking into cool grass instead of scorching sand. He tried to understand what he was seeing, but his body refused to follow his thoughts. The surge of will that had kept him alive finally drained away. His knees buckled. A low groan escaped his throat as he collapsed forward, cool earth pressing against his burning skin. Darkness closed in from the edges of his sight, wrapping around him like a quiet shroud. As his eyes shut, Thorn Kess believed this was the end. He let himself sink into the darkness, certain he would never open his eyes again. But he was wrong. He was not dying. He had simply crossed the threshold into something that felt like home. Time behaves strangely when a man drifts along the thin line between breath and silence. For Thorn Kess, it stopped obeying rules altogether. It became a dark current, pulling him under, sweeping him through fractured memories of gunfire and frozen nights. Faces stared back at him. Men he once called brothers, eyes heavy with accusation. He floated there endlessly, suspended, waiting for judgment to fall. He expected iron shackles when he woke. He expected the barked command of a bounty hunter, or the still eternal quiet of death. Yet when the darkness finally loosened its grip and broke apart like early morning fog, pain did not greet him. Instead, he woke to a scent. It was not blood, not fear, not the dry choke of desert dust. It was bright, clean, and alive. Crushed mint, damp soil, the unmistakable breath of something growing. A rough groan dragged from Thorn's throat, scraping against dryness as he tried to breathe it in. When he shifted, a muted ache throbbed through his shoulder, a reminder of the bullet still buried in memory. But the white-hot agony was gone. His eyelids fluttered open. Shapes swam in warm shadows. He was lying on something soft, not the merciless stone of the canyon floor, but layered furs spread across sweet-dried grass. He glanced down at himself. His coat was missing. His shirt had been sliced open where lead had torn through flesh. A bandage lay across the wound, but not a filthy scrap torn from gear. This cloth was clean, pale, almost gentle. Beneath it, a cooling poultice pressed against his skin, a mixture of herbs and clay drawing the heat away. Someone had washed the blood away. Someone had stitched his flesh with careful precision. Hands steady, patient, unafraid. For a man who had learned to expect only cruelty from the world, that tenderness was unsettling. It made no sense. Instinct exploded inside him, sharp, violent, unforgiving. "Where's my gun?" Thorn's hand snapped to his hip, fingers clawing for the familiar weight of steel, but his grasp closed on nothing but air and fur. His heart slammed hard against his ribs. He was unarmed, exposed. Panic burned up his throat, thick and bitter. He tried to push himself upright, to drag backward, to find something, anything, that could be used as a weapon. A rasping sound escaped him as he forced his body onto his good arm, eyes darting wildly through the space around him. He wasn't inside a deep cave after all. It was a shallow stone alcove, shielded by an overhanging cliff. Golden light drifted inward from the hidden canyon beyond, hazy and warm. And then, movement caught his eye. She stood near the mouth of the alcove, framed by sunlight, watching him. She did not look dangerous. She did not look like a rescuer either. She looked unreal, like a vision shaped by fever and exhaustion. Her name, he would later learn, was Niall. She was barely 22, yet in that still moment she felt timeless. She was not wild in the way men imagined wildness. She was neither filthy nor ragged. There was something otherworldly about her presence. She wore a faded calico dress, the kind a settler's daughter might once have owned. But it had been carefully repaired, reinforced with soft buckskin patches, stitched together like a bridge between two lives, 1 foot in memory, 1 foot in the wilderness. Her hair fell loose around her shoulders, the color of dried wheat beneath an autumn sun. Yet it was her stillness that stole Thorn's breath. When he jerked upright, she did not flinch. She did not gasp. She only watched, hands steady. A small wooden bowl rested between her palms. Thorn opened his mouth to demand her name, to ask where his revolver was, but the words vanished before reaching his tongue. Because behind her, out in the emerald glow of the canyon, something stirred. He expected wolves, or guard dogs. Instead, his breath caught. Horses, wild mustangs. Their coats carried the colors of the land itself, roan, chestnut, dusted white, moving quietly through the grass as if they belonged to the silence. For a moment, Thorn wondered if he was still dreaming. Spotted white coats moved through the grass only a few yards from the alcove, heads lowered as they grazed in calm silence. They wore no reins, no ropes, no fences. They were not owned. They were free. One stallion stood apart from the others, massive, broad-chested. His coat carried the deep shade of gathering storm clouds. He lifted his head slowly and looked past the young woman, locking eyes with Thorn Kess. The horse released a long breath through flared nostrils, a low, vibrating rumble that rolled through the air. Yet there was no fear in him. He did not shy away from Niall. Instead, he stepped close, moving with heavy, deliberate grace. His shoulder brushed her arm as he passed, a familiar gesture, gentle, trusting. Thorn felt a jolt of understanding strike him. She wasn't hiding among them. She belonged to them. She stood within the herd, not as a handler with a whip, but as one of their own. There was authority in her posture, yes, but it was quiet, the kind of strength that comes from stillness, the kind that steadies chaos rather than commands it. "Who are you?" Thorn croaked, his voice scraped raw from disuse. The girl did not answer. She didn't even blink. She stepped forward, leaving the sunlit grass and entering the shadow of the alcove. The stallion shifted, ready to follow, alert, protective. But Niall made a subtle motion with her fingers, barely visible. The great animal stopped instantly, lowering his head back to the grass. Only then did she kneel beside Thorn. Up close, he noticed the fine details of her face, skin warmed by the sun, freckles scattered across the bridge of her nose like stars. But it was her eyes that held him captive. Amber brown, clear, deep. They were the eyes of someone who had watched the world burn and chosen to rebuild instead of turning to ash with it. Ancient eyes, weighted with a wisdom no 22-year-old should carry. "My gun," Thorn said quietly, the command stripped of anger. "Where is it?" She did not reply. She did not gesture. Niall simply set the wooden bowl down on a flat stone beside him. Steam drifted upward, carrying the rich scent of bone broth and wild sage. Silence stretched between them, not the empty quiet of discomfort, not the awkward pause of strangers. This silence was intentional, chosen. It felt like peace. Her gaze drifted to his wounded shoulder, focused, careful, examining the bandage without touching it. Then she lifted the bowl again, dipped a wooden spoon into the broth, and raised it gently toward his lips. Thorn hesitated. He was a grown man, a fighter who had charged into gunfire, a soldier who had survived battles that shattered others. Being fed like a child, being this helpless, cut sharply against his pride. He tried to lift his own hand to take the spoon, but his arm betrayed him, trembling violently. Strength drained away before it reached halfway. He looked at her, heat rising in his face, frustration burning beneath his skin. Niel did not smile. She did not tease. She did not pity him. She simply waited. Her expression held absolute patience, unmoving, unshaken. It was the patience of stone-enduring wind, present, unyielding. Thorn released a slow, uneven breath. His gaze dropped to the spoon, then returned to her amber eyes. And for the first time in years, perhaps for the first time since childhood, he stopped resisting. He opened his mouth. She fed him slowly. The broth was warm and full-bodied, spreading through his chest like sunlight poured into his veins. Niel moved with a steady rhythm, lift, wait, lower, never rushing him. Her hand never trembled. With the scent of mint and horses drifting through the alcove, the space between them quietly narrowed. This closeness went deeper than touch, deeper than words. He was placing his life in her hands. Spoon by spoon, Thorn understood something he hadn't known before, that she wasn't only mending his body. Through silence, through patience. She was giving him what he had been starving for. Rest. In the canyon, time did not move by ticking clocks or bugle calls. It passed with the slow arc of the sun as it climbed and slid along the red stone walls. Morning arrived as a thin ribbon of gold along the canyon rim. By noon, the valley below drowned beneath a brutal white glare. And when evening came, it brought a long curtain of violet shadow, rolling in like a tide meant to cool the stone. For Thorn Kess, time lost its edges. The days blurred together into one slow rhythm of recovery. The fever that had consumed him finally broke on the third night, leaving his body drained, but his mind clear. The tearing fire in his shoulder faded into a steady, pulsing ache, still present, still honest, but no longer a chain binding him to the ground. He slipped into a routine, not one shaped by commands or bugle calls, but guided by the quiet movements of the woman who had pulled him back from death. Most mornings, he sat beneath the cottonwood trees and watched her. There was little else he could do, and as the hours passed, he realized how wrong his first judgment had been. Niel was not merely surviving in this hidden place. She was not a lost soul clinging to shelter. She was reigning over it. He watched her move among the driftborn with a calm authority that made something ache deep in his chest. She approached a nervous mare, whispering sounds that weren't quite words, and checked its hooves with practiced care. Later, she ground corn against a flat stone, her arms rising and falling in a slow, steady rhythm that felt almost hypnotic. Dust drifted lazily through beams of sunlight around her. She wove baskets from river reeds, fingers swift and precise. From nothing, she shaped what was needed, and what was beautiful. Thorn remained seated nearby, a man whose life had been spent tearing things apart, breaking lines, breaking horses, breaking men, and now he watched someone who knew only how to mend and create. A strange feeling took root inside him, one he hadn't known in years. It wasn't fear, and it wasn't pain. It was unworthiness. He studied his own hands, scarred and hardened by war and rains, then looked again at the quiet world she had built within the canyon walls. He felt like a wolf that had wandered into a cathedral. He did not belong in a place like this. A kingdom of one. And yet, whenever Niel met his gaze, there was no judgment in her eyes. Only that same deep, unsettling patience. One afternoon, while Niel knelt by the creek gathering watercress, Thorn pushed himself upright. His legs felt steadier now, strength slowly returning to muscles long starved of rest. He made his way toward the back of the alcove, the space she had claimed as her home. It was simple, sparse, a bed of furs, bundles of drying herbs, and on a natural stone shelf carved into the rock, something that did not belong to the wild. His fingers brushed cool leather, a book, a Bible. But it was no longer whole. The cover was warped and blackened, curled inward as if it had survived fire. The page edges were burned brittle, threatening to crumble at the slightest touch. He opened it carefully. The scent of old smoke rose instantly, sharp, bitter, cutting through the sage. It was the smell of a home burning, the smell of grief long buried. Inside the cover lay a small locket, rusted and fused shut by heat. Whatever it once held was lost forever, but the metal still carried the scars of flame. It was my mother's. The words were barely louder than breath. Yet in the silence of the alcove, they struck like thunder. Thorn turned sharply, guilt flushing his face. He hadn't heard her return. Niall stood at the entrance, a basket of damp greens resting against her hip. She wasn't angry. Her expression was open, unguarded. She set the basket down and approached him slowly. She did not take the Bible from his hands. Instead, she reached out and touched his wrist. Her fingers were cool from the creek water, and the moment she made contact, a quiet shock ran straight through him, sharp, unexpected, and impossible to ignore. She gently folded the book shut in his hands, then caught his sleeve and gave it a quiet pull, guiding him deeper into the alcove, past the place where he slept. She led him to a section of stone hidden in shadow. Thorn narrowed his eyes. The rock face was marked, covered in dark lines, charcoal drawings. But these were not the careless scratches of a child. They were deliberate, detailed, and deeply unsettling. He saw a homestead sketched in harsh strokes, lines pressed hard, angry. He saw fire devouring the roof, saw riders on horseback, faceless shapes cut from darkness, and then a child, small, terrified, running toward the canyon, running away from the world of men. Thorn stared at the black figures burned into red stone. He didn't need an explanation. The story lived in ash and grief, a slaughter, a family erased, one child left breathing, who found safety not in people, but in the quiet mercy of the earth itself. He turned toward her. Niall was tracing the line of the fleeing child with the tip of her finger. "You're a ghost," Thorn said softly, emotion thickening his voice. "Just like me." She lifted her gaze to his. For the first time, something in her steadiness fractured. Tears shimmered unshed in her eyes. She nodded once. That single motion closed the distance between them. They were no longer healer and wounded man, no longer stranger and savior. They were two souls scarred by the same fire, survivors who had fled the cruelty of men and found refuge here to mend. The silence around them changed. It was no longer empty calm. It was shared. 2 days later, the heat pressed down mercilessly. The air stood thick and unmoving. Thorn felt the residue of illness still clinging to him. Sweat, dust, echoes of fever. He took a small piece of saproot Niall had left behind and made his way to the stream. He pulled his shirt free, movement stiff and uncertain. Heat struck his skin as he knelt beside the water and splashed his face and chest. Relief washed over him, but when he tried to reach his injured arm behind his back, a sharp, biting pain tore through his shoulder. He sucked in a breath through his teeth. The saproot slipped from his fingers. His arm dropped uselessly to his side. He remained there, staring at the rippling water, frustration boiling in his gut. He was a man who had once shattered lines of men, who could shoot a coin from the air at 50 paces. And now he couldn't even clean the dust from his own skin. Broken. Useless. A shadow crossed the stream. He didn't look back. He knew who it was. The horses had not stirred. The birds still sang. Niall knelt behind him. He heard the soft whisper of her dress settling into the grass, felt the water tremble as she dipped her hands in. "You don't have to," Thorn murmured, head lowered. "I can manage." She ignored him, as she always did when pride spoke instead of truth. Then her wet hands touched his back. Thorn forgot how to breathe. Her palms were small, but strong. She lifted the saproot, working it between her hands before pressing them gently against his skin. She began at his lower back, movements firm and measured, traveling slowly upward along his spine. She washed away the dust, the sweat. Yet it felt like more than that. It felt as though she were rinsing years from him, the long rides, the frozen nights, the weight of every life he carried on his conscience. The sensation overwhelmed him, warm hands against cool water, her closeness wrapped around him. He heard her breathing, soft and steady, just behind his ear. He caught the scent of sun-warmed cotton and wild mint. When she reached his shoulders, she slowed, careful near the bandage. Her fingers brushed the bruised skin with a tenderness that sent his heart pounding. Thorn closed his eyes. His hands, resting on his knees, began to shake. He clenched his thighs, trying to steady himself. But the trembling would not stop, not from pain. It was the raw intensity of her touch that undid him. When Niall leaned closer to reach the space between his shoulder blades, her arm brushed lightly against his neck. Every fine hair along his skin lifted at once. The air between them thickened, dense, weighted, charged. This was not the reckless hunger found in saloon corners or midnight rooms. This was something older, deeper. It was the pull of two forces drawn together without permission, like iron answering iron. Thorn felt an unfamiliar exposure settle over him. He had turned his back to her, the most vulnerable position a soldier could offer, and she treated that surrender with reverence. Her hand slid gently around to the front of his shoulder. Her fingers came to rest against his collarbone. For a moment, she stopped. Her palm remained there, directly over his pounding heart. Thorn turned his head slowly. She stood close enough now that he could see the pulse fluttering at her throat. He caught the gold flecks buried within her amber eyes, saw her lips part slightly as her breath caught for just a heartbeat. She studied his face, the scars, the rough beard, the eyes shaped by too much death. And she did not turn away. She did not retreat. In that quiet space, words were unnecessary. "I see you," her gaze said. "I see your wounds, and I am not afraid of them." "I am yours," his heart answered. "Broken as I am yours." Slowly, Niall withdrew her hand. The absence of her touch struck him like cold water. A sudden emptiness rushed in where warmth had been. She rose to her feet, droplets slipping from her fingers. She did not smile, but something gentle had softened her expression. Then she turned and walked back toward the alcove, leaving Thorn kneeling beside the stream, cleaned, unsteady, and utterly, irrevocably in love. He watched her go and understood something with absolute clarity. The war he had carried his entire life was finished. The only battle that remained was keeping her safe. Peace, my friends, is a fragile thing. Out in the high desert, it is as delicate as a cactus bloom, brilliant, beautiful, yet forever threatened by the unforgiving sun. For weeks, Thorn and Niall lived inside a quiet shelter of time, a world governed only by sunrise and running water. But the world of men doesn't tolerate peace for long. It resents being forgotten. It refuses to leave debts unpaid. And the past? The past is a hunter that never rests. Its arrival did not come with thunder or gunfire. There was no cavalry charge, no cannon's roar. It arrived as silence, heavier than wind. It began with the horses. Late afternoon light poured gold across the canyon, turning the red stone into something that looked aflame from within. Niall knelt by the creek, weaving willow branches into a basket. Nearby, Thorn worked a knife along a wet stone, the steady shh filling the air. Then, the rhythm broke. Cinder, the great storm-colored stallion, snapped his head up. His ears flattened tight against his skull, a warning carved from instinct. He did not flee. He struck the ground with his forehooves, a heavy challenge that trembled through the canyon floor. The mares reacted at once, drawing their foals backward in silent formation. Niall's hands stilled on the willow branches. She lifted her eyes to the stallion, then to the narrow fissure in the rock. The only path in, the only path out. Thorn felt it at the same time. The hair rose along the back of his neck. An instinct he believed weeks of peace had buried surged violently awake, the instinct of prey sensing the predator. He rose to his feet, ignoring the tight protest in his healing shoulder. He did not need to see the intruder. He already knew who was coming. This wasn't a lost traveler. It wasn't some wandering prospector chasing rumors of silver. It was the law, or at least the version of it forged from iron and cold purpose, the same force that had been hunting him since the day he fled. Thorn Kess turned toward Niall. The softness that had slowly returned to his face over the past weeks vanished. In its place settled the old expression, the soldier's mask. "Hide," he said quietly. The word carried the weight of command, born not from rank, but from desperate love. "Go to the back caves. Don't come out." He expected her to obey, expected fear to send her running, expected her to become the fragile girl he had once imagined her to be. But Niall did not move toward the caves. She rose to her feet. Her eyes were wide, not with terror, but with a fierce, frightening resolve. She looked at Thorn, truly looked at him, and she saw the truth. He was unarmed. The blade in his hand was meant for skinning rabbits, not for standing against the law. She turned and ran, not away from danger. She sprinted toward a hollowed log near the sleeping firs and reached deep inside. Thorn watched, stunned, as she pulled free a heavy bundle wrapped in oilcloth. She crossed back to him and unrolled the cloth. Inside lay his revolver, but it was not the filthy, dust-choked weapon he had collapsed with weeks earlier. The metal gleamed, cleaned of rust. The cylinder had been oiled, the grip polished smooth by careful hands. She had tended the very tool of violence, the symbol of a world she despised. Because she understood, with a wisdom far beyond her years, that one day the warrior might need his blade again. She held the revolver out to him. Her hands were steady. Her eyes were not. What she offered was more than steel. She was returning the man he had tried to bury. She was granting him permission to become dangerous again, but not for a flag, not for a captain. This time, for her. Thorn took the weapon. Its weight settled into his palm with grim familiarity. He met her gaze, wanting to promise he would never fire it, but he could not lie. He holstered the revolver. The metallic click rang through the quiet garden like distant thunder. "Stay here," he whispered. He stepped close for a single heartbeat, breathing in the scent of mint and sage, memorizing it. Then he turned toward the curtain of ivy. The intruder waited just beyond it, in the narrow throat of the Slot Canyon. He was a marshal, a solitary figure carved from the same unforgiving stone as the desert itself. A long, dust-stained coat hung from his shoulders. The tin star on his chest was dull, scoured lifeless by sand and years. This was a man known for relentless pursuit, a tracker who followed blood like a hound. He had traced the week-old droplets Thorn had left behind, picking his way through the stone maze with obsessive patience. Thorn stepped through the ivy. Heat slammed into him at once, brutal and blinding after the cool sanctuary behind him. They faced one another at 20 paces. Wind tore through the canyon, snapping their coats against their legs. "I figured you crawled in here to die," Bram Calder called out. His voice rasped like gravel grinding together. "You're a hard man to kill, Thorn Kess." "And you're a hard man to shake," Thorn answered, his hand hovering near his hip. "You know I can't let you walk," Calder said, shifting his stance. "You turned on your own. You betrayed the uniform. That makes you a traitor." Thorn let out a dry, humorless laugh. "I turned on a captain who wanted to burn a village full of sleeping women. If that makes me a traitor, Marshal, then I'll wear the name." "The law doesn't care about your reasons," Calder spat. "It only cares about orders." "Step out," he added. "Maybe you'll get a trial." Thorn shook his head. "You and I both know there's no trial waiting for me. Only a rope." Calder's jaw tightened. "Then it'll be the rope." The Marshal sneered, his hand twitching near his holster. "You're nothing but a dog that turned on its master." Thorn Kess didn't flinch. "Better a wolf than a blind dog," he fired back. "Go home, Marshal," he added. "There's nothing waiting for you here but heat and hard luck." Bram Calder's eyes narrowed. His gaze slid past Thorn, to the ivy behind him. He saw the green. He saw the life concealed beyond the stone. And in that instant, he understood something dangerous. Thorn wasn't hiding. He was guarding something. "Who's back there with you?" Calder demanded, stepping forward. That step was his mistake. Thorn drew. The movement was instinct, pure muscle memory honed by years of survival. But Calder was fast, infamously fast. 2 gunshots erupted almost as one, so close together they sounded fused. Crack! Boom! The canyon exploded with noise, the reports ricocheting off stone like the end of the world. Pain slammed into Thorn's side like a sledgehammer. He twisted, his boot sliding on loose shale, and crashed hard behind a massive boulder. Fire ripped across his ribs. A hit. Not deep, but close. Too close. A second round shattered rock inches from his face, spraying grit into his eyes. "You're pinned, boy," Calder shouted, his voice closer now. "Nowhere left to run." Thorn pressed himself flat against the sandstone, breath tearing in and out of his chest. He checked the cylinder. Pinned. Wounded. And standing between the cold reach of the law outside and the warm heart of the sanctuary behind him was his failing body. He was losing. Dust choked the air. The bitter sting of gunpowder burned his lungs. He flattened himself harder against the rock, listening as heavy boots crunched closer over gravel. He checked his revolver again. 2 rounds left. 2 bullets to protect the only thing left in his world that mattered. His grip tightened. He braced himself to rise, to trade his life for hers in one final violent exchange. But the canyon had other intentions. And the canyon had a queen. Thorn heard it first. Not a gunshot, but a sound that sliced through the chaos like a blade. A whistle. Sharp. Piercing. Impossible to ignore. It came from above. Thorn looked up. Niall stood on a high ridge overlooking the narrow pass. She wasn't hidden in shadow. She stood fully bathed in sunlight. Her hair snapped in the wind like a war banner. She did not look frightened. She looked like the land itself given form. She raised her arm and brought it down in a single commanding sweep. The ground answered. At first, a low tremor rolled through the canyon, like distant thunder waking beneath the earth. Then it grew into a roar rising from the green valley beyond. A flood of muscle and fury surged forward. The drift-born, the wild mustangs had heard her call. Bram Calder froze, eyes widening as he stared down the canyon throat. He didn't see a woman standing on stone. He saw a wall of charging horses, roans, paints, dust-streaked bodies, and at their head ran Cinder, the great storm-colored stallion. They did not attack him. They overwhelmed him. They flowed like a living river, unstoppable, merciless. Hooves struck sparks from stone as they thundered through the narrow pass. Calder dove aside, scrambling up jagged rock to avoid being crushed beneath the stampede. The canyon erupted with chaos, screaming wind, pounding hooves, shrill cries. Dust swallowed the world. Within that blinding storm, Thorn moved. He did not flee. He slipped through the haze like a shadow. When the dust finally settled, the herd was already vanishing into the open desert. Work complete. Bram Calder lay sprawled in the dirt, stunned, coughing, disoriented, before he could reach for his weapon. Cold steel pressed against his temple. Thorn Kess stood over the fallen marshal, his eyes stripped of mercy. His finger curled tighter around the trigger. This was the man who had hunted him like prey, the man who had dared to drag violence to Niel's sanctuary. The soldier within Thorn, the part forged by war, knew exactly what came next. You end the threat. You finish it. "Do it!" Bram Calder rasped, blood slipping from a cut along his brow. "Add another sin to your name." Thorn's jaw clenched. He thumbed the hammer back. Click. Then he felt it. A touch. Light as a breath, yet heavy as stone. A hand rested against his chest, directly over his heart. He didn't need to turn to know who it was. The scent of sage after rain filled the air, washing over the sting of gunpowder. Niel stood beside him. She did not reach for the gun. She did not beg. She only placed her palm against him and slowly shook her head. Her amber eyes locked onto his. And in them, he saw no plea for the marshal's life, only a plea for his soul. "You are not a killer," her gaze told him. "Not anymore. Don't let him turn you back into one." Thorn looked at her. His hand trembled. Slowly, painfully, he lowered the revolver. The hammer slid back into place with a soft, metallic sigh. He looked down at Bram Calder. "You walk back," Thorn said, his voice raw with mercy. "You walk back to the world of men, and you tell them the ghost they were hunting is gone. He died in this canyon. They bound the marshal's hands and sent his horse running free into the Badlands. Then they watched him begin the long, punishing march toward civilization, defeated not by a bullet, but by a grace he could not comprehend. The sun sank lower, bruising the sky with streaks of purple and fire orange. Silence returned to the canyon, but it was no longer the same. The secret had been broken, the sanctuary exposed. Thorn stood near the water, packing his saddlebags. His movements were slow, waited. He knew the truth. Calder would return, or others would come. He could not allow that darkness to reach Niel again. He tightened the cinch on the fresh horse she had given him and turned to face her, his chest aching. He gathered the words. "Goodbye. Thank you. I will never forget you." But they never left his throat. Niel was not standing there watching him leave. She was packing. A leather satchel lay open at her feet. filled with dried meat, herbs, and the charred Bible. She slung it over her shoulder and walked past him without hesitation. Straight to the great storm-colored stallion. With practiced grace, she mounted Cinder and looked down at him from the saddle. Sunset caught fire in her hair. She looked wild, regal, certain. Thorn stared at her, stunned. "Niela," he said, his voice breaking. "It's a hard life out there, a dangerous one. I have nothing to offer you but the road." She held his gaze. For weeks she had been silent, letting her hands and eyes speak for her. Now she needed him to hear the choice she was making. When she spoke, her voice was rough from disuse, but clear as truth. "Take me west." 3 words, a lifetime promised within them. Thorn exhaled, realizing he had been holding his breath since the moment he crawled into that canyon. A slow smile crossed his face, the first true smile of a free man. He mounted his horse. He did not look back at the cave. He did not look back at the life he was leaving behind. He looked only at her. West. Together they rode out of the canyon as the sun slipped beneath the horizon. 2 figures stood in silhouette beneath the endless sky of the American frontier. Thorn Kess had gone searching for a place to disappear. Instead, he discovered a reason to keep breathing. In the quiet heart of the painted canyon, a wounded warrior finally found peace. And a solitary young woman found someone willing to stand between her and the world. They were no longer ghosts wandering broken ground. They were alive. And the horizon before them stretched wide and waiting. And that, my friends, is where we leave Thorn and Niel, riding toward a future with no visible end. I hope this story carried a little warmth into your day, because I believe every one of us holds a canyon like that inside our chest, a place where we long to feel safe. To be seen, to be understood, without having to explain a single word. Finally, let me send my deep thanks to you. Your presence means more than you know. If today's story awakened something inside you, don't let the trail end here. There are many more tales of courage, devotion, and faith waiting to be discovered. Subscribe, comment, share, and come back as we continue this unforgettable journey. Thank you, truly. Aviso legal bara disclaimer. All stories are intended solely for entertainment and may include fictionalized scenarios or dramatization derived from historical contexts. While AI assists in production, human creators supervise and adjust every piece to maintain sincerity, credibility, and emotional quality. We adhere entirely to platform regulations regarding AI content, ensuring no deepfakes or misleading portrayals. Licensed materials are used responsibly. Republishing, modifying, or extracting content without authorization is not allowed. We appreciate every viewer who respects originality and creative effort.